So I'm Keely Horsey. I usually go by Key. This first entry that I did is on bone carving. So here's a bit of the shock factor is we can't actually prove belts were period because they're organic materials, they break down. So what we have been able to find are belt buckles. And logic would say that we do actually have some way of carrying a pouch since we know they don't have pockets. So this is off the assumption that we had different buckles for the bones or for the belts. I did 3 different eras of buckles. My first one was early period around the 8 to 900s. All of these take place in England. So the early period one was more of a tension buckle. It was really simple, square. It just had a spike that you would have a hole on one side, you loop the belt around it, and then you just kind of stab it through and the tension on it holds it. The next one I did was more of like a Norseman, what you would popular culture would call Vikings, of a buckle. But the burial finds was a dark green. So I recreated the dye for it, where I have one that was only being soaked for about 4 days. And then I have another one in the jar that was being soaked for about a week. But they put bits of copper. The period recipe was copper metal with vinegar that you could get from wines and alcohols that went bad, ammonia, which was usually dung or urine, and goat's milk. My modern version is water, vinegar, and peroxide. When you first mix it, it looks like a root beer float. It gets dark brown and bubbles. And then after a day, it settles and gets this bright, bright blue color. And the bone is porous enough that when it absorbs it, it turns into a dark green eventually over time. These carvings, I've only been doing bone carving for about 4 weeks. So these are my first kind of debut with bone carving. This next piece is more focused on the technique of calligraphy and illumination. I started with the question, how do they write in straight lines? So I found a couple of different ways. This first one that I have is early period that they did what's called dry pointing. They would take a needle and press it into the paper. And then I used glass, but they could use glass, bone, or wood, and they would draw grooves. I have 2 samples. One I did on the top of a towel so you can really see the ridges that come through on the scroll. The other one I did on a hard surface. It doesn't show up as much. But you do that and then you flip it over and be able to write between the lines. And you got a nice straight line with invisible markings with it. These other ones up here was later, around the 1300s, where they would use precious metals such like silver or gold. They would drag across the paper. Chemically over the time, it would look like orange or red lines. Now, I don't have gold bars laying around, so I did mine with orange ink to begin with. Both of these, though, are just trying to address some of the ways that they used period materials. Another thing I found interesting when I was doing this study is a lot of it is not paintbrush style. The things that they did to fill in the spaces were actually fine lines. They were drawings in and of themselves. They do circles, leaves, other geometric patterns, all with ink and a pen, not necessarily switching over to paintbrush. So those are a couple of the experiments. This one is based off of choir books. So there's musical notes built in. They would have had the lyrics in Latin written along with the notes. I switched it out to be our SCA Scroll Awards. Another example is my stag was the first time I've done a drawing where it was just ink and pencil, no light table, no tracing. It was just freehand. And I've discovered, because I did some mistakes on my stag, if you make the legs too short, like what I did, you're stuck with it because you're drawing with ink. It might explain why some of the drawings, the fingers look like spaghetti noodles, is if you got your portions wrong, it's not like you can erase it and redo it. You just get now weird spaghetti noodle fingers. I'm going to be doing a round 2 of this where I've been experimenting with making my own tools. So in England, they used reeds to make quills. It wasn't necessarily the Harry Potter feather style. It was more reeds. Feathers came later. I also experimented with, I found one person who made a rowel, or theorized that they did. It looks like a kind of a spur that cowboys would wear. They think you would roll it along and it would give you those even points for the dry pointing, and then you could connect the dots. Problem is, when I made mine out of bone, if you don't make it exactly straight, it wobbles and then it catches on the paper. So I'm going to do a future project making this out of metal and see if it works. It would make it a lot easier than trying to measure and make sure your lines are evenly spaced if you could just roll it. So the documentation for these, a lot of times we have formal government paperwork. For example, Alfred the Great had chronicles of his life. So they were preserved for a long time because it was the king's chronicle. But they are falling apart. It's really hard to get access to them. But one of the wonderful things a few years ago, the English royal family unlocked their archives. And a few museums are allowed to do high scans of their scrolls. So now you can go online and see the live scans of these primary sources and zoom in on them. They're so accurate that some of the books, the ink bled through to the other side, and you can see that bleed through. And so you can actually see what was on the back of the pages. So there's been some amazing museums now that are releasing scanned stuff that the royal family had kept preserved for hundreds of years. This project that I'm working on, I just started doing embroidery, but I do have experience sewing, doing cross stitch, and beadwork. So this was an experiment to combine learning embroidery for the first time with beadwork. These were modern kits, you'll probably find them online, that I started off with and added beads and my own customization to it. The idea behind this project was to see what textures beads would look best on versus what textures they would look worse on. So you'll notice when you look through these, I did different parts of birds and beads versus threads, did branches, did flowers. Through this experiment, I found that doing a bird all in beadwork doesn't look very good because the beads just aren't detailed enough, but flowers look beautiful with beads. This project is eventually they're going to get sewn onto this leather blue cape with some purple spiraling embroidery that's going to connect them all. Since they're all circles, the spiraled embroidery is also going to be circular. So you'll see that it'll be this knotwork, kind of like a road map that you'll go through and follow them. So there'll be 2 panels on the front and 3 panels on the back. This cloak, I'm probably going to cut down the middle because it's just really hot when it's all solid and it's leather. And then I'll do something similar to these where I'll have beads and buckles that can clasp it and hold it shut.